Zdravstvuyte, and welcome to episode 12 of my Soviet Union vlog. This time we're looking at Khrushchev's economic reforms, looking at theme 2 section and considering how Khrushchev tried to change and adapt, reform the economy after the death of Stalin. The actual subheading in the spec for this is about changing priorities for industry and agriculture. They've already given that sense there about change and possible continuity. And then also there's some weighing up of success and failure to do here as well. Just about the promotion of light industry, chemicals and consumer goods, investment in agriculture and the Virgin Land Scheme, and the limited effect of the reforms introduced by both Khrushchev and Brezhnev, which we'll look at next time. And that limited effect is, again, a sign that there's a success failure question out there as well, or analysis out there to be doing. So, big picture in Khrushchev's era is that from 56 to 58, Khrushchev spent a lot of energy and time and credibility, even investing in change. And things seem to go quite well, particularly in agriculture. Agriculture production is up 35% between 1954 and 58. But that from 1959 things slow down, and then by the late 60s you're really into stagnation, and obviously that's after Khrushchev, but stagnation really all the way through to the 80s, and the economic problems are piling up. In terms of changing priorities, there's a good quote here from Khrushchev, and this very much captures Khrushchev's ethos, attitude about the economy, and really about communism all round, I think. This is what he said. He said, "We must help people eat well, dress well, and live well. If after 40 years of communism, a person cannot have a glass of milk or a pair of shoes, he will not believe that communism is a good thing, no matter what you tell him." 40 years after communism, obviously from 1917 through to 57. So here Khrushchev is talking about reflecting really on the successes and failures of the Soviet state in the late 50s. And he's clearly saying, actually, we've missed something here in our heavy industry focus. We might have become a powerful country. We might have become part of the Cold War and a dominant feature in the whole world, a global power. But what matters is how people live. And so Khrushchev's changing priority is to focus more upon consumer goods, light industry, and food. Agriculture, then, that had been the sector of the economy that had recovered least convincingly, I guess, after the Second World War. And Khrushchev claimed in the 50s that she was performing less well than under the NEP in the mid-20s. It's certainly true that the Soviet Union was struggling to feed her population in the 1950s, which is embarrassing, really, for one of the global superpowers. Investment in agriculture in that time, 1954, was 3% of the Soviet budget. Khrushchev really ramps that up and puts it up to 13% by 1959. And that comes against the over the opposition of like the military industrial complex, people who want that money for them to be invested in their parts of the economy. So Khrushchev really needs to show that things have improved in order to maintain that funding in agriculture, and he doesn't. And that's one of the reasons, again, that he gets opposition mounts to Khrushchev and he's out in 64. Anyway, good things. Khrushchev reduced the quota that farms had to produce and increased prices for everything above the quota, kind of like NEP, really. So they had to give part of their produce to the state. And he said, well, we'll take less and you can sell the rest. And we will allow you to sell the rest at higher fixed prices. The impact of this was that there was a 250% increase in farm incomes between 1952 and 56. And the impact of that was that by 1955, there were 30% more tractors in the Soviet Union, 40% more fertilizer in the Soviet Union. So these farmers were then able to invest more money because they had more money to invest, and that should have seen an improvement in the efficiency of agriculture. Khrushchev also tries to expand the amount of land being farmed. We'll come back to the Virgin Land Scheme briefly in a minute, but the total area sown in the Soviet Union leapt, I tell you, from 18 million hectares in 1953, almost doubling, to 35 million hectares in 1956. And then actually to 97 million hectares by 1964. So all the way from 18 to 97 in just over a decade. They also increased the amount of people working on the land. There were 3 million people working on the land in 1956, almost 9 million in 1964. That's not necessarily a good thing. It does show more investment and more commitment, but it also shows how inefficient the agriculture sector was in the Soviet Union, in that it needed lots of people rather than being mechanized, as increasingly Western agriculture was. Production does increase though. From 1952 to 1960, cereals increased from 82 million tonnes to 120, so up by about 50%. Meat increased, meat production from 5.2 million tonnes to 8.2 million tonnes, and milk production increased from 36 million tonnes to 59 million tonnes. Although it's worth saying it's not like a steady line on a graph, and they are kind of jumping up and down a little bit, depending on the year, drought, and all that, weather conditions and stuff. The centrepiece, really, of Khrushchev's agricultural adventure was the Virgin Land Scheme. And this was an idea that they were going to find new lands in the Soviet Union to farm that hadn't been farmed before. Places in the northern Caucasus, Kazakhstan and Western Siberia. And they sold this as kind of a big adventure, like pioneering on the frontier, revolutionary type stuff. And so thousands of young communists from Komsomol bought into the vision, flocked out there to these territories. 6 million acres were cultivated. Quite a lot of investment was put in. There were 12,000 tractors provided for the scheme. But it turns out there's a reason these places hadn't been farmed before, and that was because it was really difficult to farm. There are high costs of irrigation for these areas, didn't naturally get enough rainfall. They were low in fertility. And from 1959, really, it's clear that this isn't going to work out as Khrushchev had hoped. And the harvests aren't great that year, and then they start to get worse. And eventually, the whole thing really falls apart. And that cost Khrushchev a lot because he staked, again, his credibility. This is a high profile thing. This was a Khrushchev thing. And a bit like the Cuban Missile Crisis in foreign policy, Khrushchev pays with his reputation for the Virgin Land Scheme. So turning to industry, we've already talked a little bit about how Khrushchev tried to decentralize and push decision making away from Moscow, partly to increase his own kind of power. His party members in the party, his power was in the party, whereas Mannenkov's power was centered in the state organization. So decentralizing reduced Mannenkov's power and others, and increased Khrushchev's power in comparison. So he started to do that, but in 1959, Khrushchev launched a 7-year plan, not a 5-year plan, a 7-year plan, and that kind of contradicts really his planning. And that, again, that's a sign of like what went wrong for Khrushchev, is that there's contradictory aims here. Is it decentralizing, or is it trying to centrally plan the economy? Well, it's both, and that's why it doesn't really work. There's a lot of overlap, a lot of inefficiency, a lot of muddled thinking, a lot of kind of spontaneous excitement, but not so much kind of thoughtful and thorough planning. Anyway, the 7-year plan's aim was to invest in light industry and consumer goods, which is a change from Stalin's economy, to increase chemical fertilizers to support agriculture, as we said. It's fair to say it's not a huge success. Consumer goods productions failed to meet their target by 5% below their target. Chemical fertilizers are actually 20% below their target. Although, on that, you'd want to note that in 1962, Khrushchev had increased the targets. And also, we said in a couple of episodes ago that one of the things that Khrushchev does is that he makes it so that it's not, you don't have to fear not meeting the targets. So it's possible that these figures are more accurate than figures that we might have seen under Stalin. There's less kind of lying and fabrication going on. So I guess if we took Stalin's figures with a pinch of salt here, we might say these are more accurate, but because of that, they're more disappointing. That said then, so on the plus side, 22 million new flats were built between 1956 and 65. This is very good. Although of questionable quality, they were called the Khrushchevy, Chrush from the start of Khrushchev, and then Choby, Choby. The Khrushchev slums is what they're called. Trushchovy apparently is slums in Russian. And this was kind of a joke at the expense of them. Nevertheless, people getting to live on their own, in their own flat, rather than sharing houses. That's a good thing. And likewise, the ownership of refrigerators increased tenfold from 1955 to 66. and washing machines increased massively. But look at these figures. In 1955, 4 in 1,000 people had a fridge. By 1966, it was 40 in 1,000 people. And likewise, washing machines, 1 in 1,000 people in 1955, 77 in 1,000 people in 1966. So massive increase, but still, compared to the West, very, very slow and behind in that sense. And that's illustrated nicely through car ownership. Car ownership was 5 per 1,000 people in the Soviet Union in 1966. In the UK at the same time, 200 per 1,000 people. So still not like everyone, but well ahead of where the Soviet Union was. Output does increase in the late 50s, early 60s, 55 to 66. Output of electricity increased from 170 billion kilowatts to 804 billion kilowatts, almost fivefold increased. Refrigeration manufacture increased from 151,000 to 1.7 million, about an 11-fold increase. And tractors increased from 314,000 made per year to 804,000 a year, which is kind of increasing by 2.5, 256%, if you want to be precise. And so all of that was good, but overall, you'd want to say actually that Khrushchev. In fact, I read this by Jonathan Davis. He said there were good intentions in Khrushchev's economic planning, but they were poorly thought through and even more poorly implemented. The central planning meant that fertilizers could only be used when farmers were told, and they're often told at the wrong time to use them, often too late for it to make a real difference. Khrushchev kept reforming the ministries that people were dealing with. He kept kind of thinking, no, that's kind of tinkering with them, and that meant there was a lack of stability in leadership and in the message coming through. There were poor infrastructure in the Soviet Union, meant poor storage, meant that food was often wasted, rotted kind of near the fields where it was. Poor infrastructure meant it couldn't get to the places where people were living, so that although the production was increasing, people's diet didn't necessarily get any better because they weren't getting the food to them. And although pay improved and conditions improved, we've seen that mostly people still lived in low conditions. So overall, quite a lot of change, definite change in priority, definite change in focus, also change in attitude towards the economy, but limited change in people's lives as a result, and some successes in terms of output, and some successes in terms of improved living conditions, but again, limited in how effective that was, certainly limited in how many people benefited. Next time, we'll have a look at Brezhnev and after's economic policy, and we'll see how that stuttering start stutters out and becomes stagnation. See you then.